It's part of the American dream, purchasing property, creating generational wealth. But building that American dream hasn't been equal for everyone. Terry Horton says he experienced this firsthand in 2022.
I wanted to give him the benefit of the doubt.
Part of Horton's American dream as a landlord and owner of Horton Visionary Properties was to make affordable housing units available for people in his Cincinnati community. It's why he decided to refinance his property in order to finance his dream project. To do that, Horton had to go through an appraisal process, which allows banks to determine the value of a property.
Initially, the lender gave me an estimated value of $500,000 because at the time, the interest rates was low and it was a booming market.
But when he got his appraisal back, Horton says it was a lot less than what he expected. The value was appraised at $359,000. That $141,000 difference from the initial estimate is what's called an appraisal gap. Appraisal gaps create a few problems: buyers backing out of a home sale, or, as in Horton's case, banks being reluctant to lend more money than an asset is supposedly worth.
I discovered there were some errors in the rental payments and in the square footage. And as I started to review the appraisal, I found other errors.
He also had 2 additional appraisals done on the property. Both of them came back with values higher than $359,000. Still, Horton says the lender refused to acknowledge those new valuations. Horton began to wonder if he was lowballed because of his race.
Unfortunately, this is a problem that is truly pervasive throughout the nation.
Sharon McGowan, Horton's attorney, helped him file a complaint with the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, or HUD. As a civil rights attorney, McGowan argues Horton's discrimination case falls within the Fair Housing Act.
We saw the appraiser ignore sales that had happened on the same block as Mr. Horton's property and go to a blacker part of town to find properties that he was going to treat as sort of the comparables. We saw him say that Mr. Horton's property was in good shape, but yet then kind of didn't really value that property and actually devalued the property in some ways. And I think what we see is all of these ways in which conscious and unconscious bias plays out in engaging in this process of deciding what is the value of a black homeowner worth.
The lender never responded to our questions about Horton's appraisal, and the first appraiser defended his calculation, saying in a statement he used papers submitted by Horton and that comparison properties used in the later appraisals weren't equivalent. Horton and McGowan's concerns about discriminatory practices against African American homeowners is nothing new. In the 1930s, a discriminatory practice, now known as redlining, blocked access to mortgages and other loans to entire communities, primarily those of color. Federal officials created a manual for lenders that graded neighborhoods on the financial risk of a property loan in that area. Grades heavily influenced by the race and ethnicity of those living there. Areas that were considered the best investments received an A and green shading on the map. On the other end, areas in red were deemed the riskiest or least desirable. In the explanations for low grades, federal assessors often reference the presence of African Americans, immigrants, and other minority groups as threats to the stability of property values. While the federal program that produced the maps ended in the 1940s, experts say those systemic red walls still linger to this day, including in the appraisal process.
I think that this is sort of just in many ways sort of a different version of redlining, in the sense of actually sort of engaging in the appraisal of black properties in a way that is inherently always sort of drawing down its value because of the blackness of the homeowner or because of the blackness of the neighborhood. And this is one of those things that it really needs a federal response as well as a local response.
Our national investigative team reviewed federal data on home appraisals from 2013 to 2021. When we looked at historically redlined census tracts, we found that on average, minority-owned properties experience appraisal gaps at a rate higher than those with white owners. Low valuations, often with high financial consequences. For example, when we looked at minority-owned 3-bedroom homes in redlined areas, we found when there was an appraisal gap, the difference was often more than $10,000, up to $60,000 in some cases.
We're taking measures and considering options to stamp out appraisal bias.
Zixta Martinez is Deputy Director of the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau and is on the task force charged with increasing fairness in the lending and valuation process.
Where you live is a sense of security and a sense of who you are. And systematic undervaluation of neighborhoods and communicates detrimental messaging to the people who live there and has a real toll on people.
Just because that we have disparities in outcomes, it doesn't necessarily imply the reason is racial bias.
Tobias Peter is the co-director of the Housing Center at the American Enterprise Institute.
We think that there are plenty of other explanations like locational differences, market conditions, quality of home upkeep that may explain some of these differences. So market conditions clearly matter.
But Investigate TV found multiple examples across the country of identified cases of appraisal bias. In Kentucky, an appraiser surrendered her license after describing a town as having, quote, a black race population above state average. The state and the Freddie Mac appraiser quality monitoring team found this language subjective, racial, or stereotypical, which is prohibited by real estate appraisal standards.
For African Americans, no matter where they live, they feel like they're facing racial bias. It doesn't matter if you're in a black community, white community, majority, minority community. It's something that's going to affect them. What should be done to address that?
I think that's a huge problem. And I think what would help is if we were to provide data and data that would show that the problem is it's not systemic, but that there are bad apples.
But our team found many states don't track bias-related appraisal complaints or don't make the information public.
There's a lack of minority appraisers that would really help the situation.
Thaddeus Dawson is the president of 10K Black Appraisers and 10K Minority Appraisers Foundation, two organizations working to make sure people of color are represented in the industry by offering training programs, paid internships, and other opportunities to young people.
And unfortunately, due to the bias and discrimination, people of color have lost a tremendous amount of equity that they will never, ever be able to recover. So that equity is what separates you from poverty and opens up legacies.
As for Horton's dream, for now, it'll have to wait. By the time Horton's lender finally acknowledged one of the other appraisals and offered him a refinance plan, the interest rates had risen and were too high to complete his American dream.
It was my goal, and I'll continue to strive to do that. But I also want to make sure that this doesn't happen to anyone else.
Win or lose, Horton says he'll continue pushing for fair and equitable appraisals so other minority homeowners aren't left feeling undervalued. For Investigate TV, I'm Carice Jackman.